Caddis Maximus here, this time with the Harbor Freight Pittsburgh steel cable cutters. I'll say right off the bat that these are not the best for high strength lifting cable, aircraft cable, hardened steel or alloy steel cables. Mainly because they use a chrome molybdenum jaws, which are going to be pretty tough, but it's a more cost-effective material and just isn't quite as hard as, say, a much more expensive set of HK Porters, which would run you about 60 bucks. These things are 20 bucks on sale. They have 28-inch handles, and part number is 6649. Harbor Freight's been selling these for a real long time. So a few tips when you buy these to have your best results. One is make sure before you're buying them, there's some varying degrees of sharpness on the jaws, and it's real easy just to open them up and make sure you get a pair. There was a pair there that was new, but something happened with the grinding and the jaws are already kind of dull. Second thing is when you get home, make sure that the center bolt is nice and tight. There was a little bit loose on that, and you'll have a little bit better results. Speaking of using these type of cable cutters, these would, I would say, be rated for about 1/2 inch of mild steel cable, but once again, like lifting and winching cable, it's going to damage the jaws. That type of cable is actually very difficult to cut with any type of cutters. And many nice cutters will cut that kind of cable a certain number of times until inevitably the jaws wear out, because you're using hardened steel to try to cut hardened steel. It's only going to last so long. Really, for smaller high-strength cable, I really recommend using the chisel and a piece of steel. You use a cold chisel and a piece of steel as an anvil, and hitting that with a hammer really works well on like 1/4 inch and smaller cable. You can use sledgehammers, but it's a bit more difficult when you get up to the larger cable sizes, say 5/16 and 3/8. And mainly because cold chisels are very hard and they're easy to resharpen, and it's a cheap method. On thicker cable, angle grinders are about the best way to really cut it. I think these would be excellent for like aluminum and heavy duty solid electrical cables, and that's primarily what I got them for, but I am going to take a shot at cutting some 1/4 inch bicycle cable here. A lot of complaints, not only about these Harbor Freights, but many of these kinds of cutters, is the fact that when you're cutting smaller cable, it just seems inevitable that they fold under, and it is, because optimally you want to keep the cable as parallel as perpendicular going crossways through the jaws as possible. As the cables are starting to bend over, it makes it real easy to get those hard wires caught in between the jaws. That's one of the reasons the jaws are so thick on these. And that would be the same case even if you had some real premium cutters, such as these Felco C16s. These kind of cutters will retail over $300. Just to replace the jaws on these is $135. They're made in Switzerland. And even on these, you can see that the jaws inevitably get chowdered up and then strands don't get cut, etc. And for good measure, if you ever see cutters like these, which look similar to these types of cable cutters, but have more rounded jaws and that the metal is thinner, those are for electric only. I've seen a lot of those blown out, so I figured I'd mention that. I will mention that there was the finish, the black oxide finish, the industrial finish is pretty rough, and these things really felt like they had sandpaper, so I kind of cleaned them up. They were totally dry, so you want to oil these as well. And at the Harbor Freight, I asked about the warranty, because these are, surprisingly enough, lifetime warranty. And he said, yeah, if the handles come loose, bolts break, jaws bend or break off, they're kind of tough if it just looks like it's just been used until the jaws are chowdered. But he says most times they'll still replace it then. And so I was kind of surprised to hear about that for $20 on sale. And they're really willing to uphold the lifetime warranty. These would be great heavy-duty cutters for all sorts of stuff, even like mild steel and aluminum wire. Just not for the heavy-duty stuff. And you just be wary when you are cutting steel wire. And you can get the best cutters in the world, and I can put a big wrapping of piano wire in there, and it will destroy. Piano wire is notorious for being extremely hard, and you basically need carbide cutters to cut it. And I'm sure there's some types of these that do have carbide, but the problem is when you get up to those hardness levels, it ends up being way too brittle. And ultimately, abrasives are your friend. So I'm doing 3 wrappings because I found when you're cutting thinner cable, it's kind of nice to try to, or it's a little bit better when you try to bunch it up so there's just a little bit more meat for the jaws to grab into versus just trying to cut one little 1/4 inch strand. But we'll see how these do. Wow, that actually requires a bit of force. Let me get into a better position here. And it actually did it. A couple strands did pull through. This was bicycle lock cable, so this is I would consider a pretty extreme situation because it's going to be hardened steel cable. We did see it did pull just a couple strands, but only on one section, surprisingly enough. If we take a look at all these other ends, there's actually a lot of ends here. All these other ends are actually cut cleanly, but this is only going to do that so many times. Okay, after that, just that one cut, the thing with molybdenum steels, it just isn't going to get as hard as other grades of tool steels. And just that one cut, we can already see a little bit of rounding and chattering right along that edge there. You'd probably get away with a few more cuts, but it would probably, you know, stop cutting that kind of wire at around 20, 30 cycles, probably only like 20. Here's a look at the other side, the other jaw. You can see how much of this stuff is coming off of my fingers just from one oiling. So anyway, that's kind of the end of the review of this Harbor Freight set of cutters. They're really on sale for 20 bucks. They're a great deal, but they're just not meant for any kind of high strength steel wire rope and cable. I think they would be pretty good for an electrician in various situations where you're cutting copper and aluminum cable. These things would be great for really thick, you know, 5/8 inch, even 3/4 inch cables. You would have to stand on them. I was actually putting quite my body weight just to cut through the 3 strands of this. And they're kind of heavy, but overall the handles actually I didn't feel them flexing or bowing, and they have some couple of decent grips on them. So really, for the price, I think they're exactly as expected. They're pretty decent, and I'll continue to use them even with a couple nicks on the jaws for a long time until they totally blow out. And I should point out that when they did grind these, that the jaw surface is raised up above the rest of the surface of these, and we can see that they are indeed forged jaws because it has that wide flashing area where it's squeezed out between the forging dies. But this allows you to take them apart and take a stone, and it will take a little bit of time, but you can resharpen both halves, and they do have a nice feature as to where right there is where it meets up. They have a lot of overlap. One that serves to help break wires that do get folded under, but also as you sharpen, the edge gets moved down this taper, and like on those Felcos, they have it really close, so when it wears, you end up with a little gap. And on these, when it wears and when you resharpen them, you won't have that little gap. Anyway, I really appreciate everybody watching and subscribing, and if you haven't subscribed, please do. Until next time, Catus Maximus out.